and then it's like, whoa, I hadn't thought this through yet.
Yeah, I thought it through. In fact, it was a 4 hour drive there, so.
All right, yeah. Ready to start? Yeah.
Well, you told it about.
Right. So today, in the light of the recent hurricanes that have drifted their way through Louisiana, I thought environmentalism would be a good topic kind of to discuss, particularly because I saw I think yesterday in Bangkok, they failed to come to a good conclusion at the UN on how they're going to move forward with basically building guidelines to implement the 2015 Paris Accords in terms of how we're going to keep from burning ourselves alive on this planet. And so I wanted to have the discussion, and this one will be a little bit shorter from my end, and then we can kind of debate what y'all think about it. So, how does environmentalism and humanism match up? What is it we should be doing? What are some things that we should kind of know about, and how do we move forward to advance and protect humanity for the long term? So we'll go through it kind of quickly, and then we'll just have a good open discussion. So, of course, one of the missions, right, for the church, or kind of the primary mission, is to advance and protect humanity. Right. So we talk about that most every service. To me, that's kind of the point, right? So if we're going to have an overarching goal other than just continuing our own personal existence, it should be the continuance of human existence in general. And that's environmentalism to me seems very critical, integral, you might say, to the continued human existence, as we haven't figured out a way to live off this planet yet. So what does that mean for us? What should we be doing? How do we wrap our minds around keeping the planet healthy as a resource for us? So obviously there's, everyone's heard of climate change, global warming, the discussion surrounding it. When I hear about these discussions and I hear people having opinions about it, it's something that to me seems a bit silly, because a lot of people want to express their opinion. Well, I think there is climate change, I think there isn't climate change, or even if you think there is, that there is something we can do about it, or there isn't, or what happens to the economy when we start to implement some of these changes, right? So these are all questions that people have. To me, it comes down to a simpler question. It doesn't matter if it is or isn't warming. It doesn't matter who's causing it and why, and it really doesn't matter the economic impacts. What really matters is, does it promote our continued existence, right? So some scientists think we're in the Anthropocene era, right? So the era that is determined by human activity, right? So we have become such a powerful force on the planet that we are now affecting the way the planet operates. So they basically have come up with this word to say we are in the time frame. So instead of like the Jurassic period, it's the human period. And so if that's the case, to me, the fundamental question is, have we yet figured out how to control our environment in a sustainable way? So the answer is no. I don't think we've invested necessarily the time, effort, energy, and most importantly, understanding to know how to do that, and if we should, and how that would work. So I personally don't care if it's getting warmer or colder, or we're flying off orbit, whatever it happens to be. We should start to think about these questions, because these are really the critical questions that underpin humans' continued existence. So that's kind of the thing that I think of when I first hear the political arguments and people trying to be right. We go back to the service on how to win emotional arguments, and a lot of it comes down to people really want to be right about things. They don't really even care what the topics are. They just like being right or proving other people wrong and feeling right. But that to me is really not nearly as important as, do we get to continue living tomorrow? Do my kids have to suffer through a world that's miserable? I prefer that not to happen. So a couple of things for those who may be a little bit less read in. So there are some different areas of concern that people have, right? So with global warming, you got the temperature, right? Temperature goes up, it gets hotter. that's one element of it, right? More heat waves, and we've seen that cities around the world are not prepared for the level and the duration of heat that happens during these warm periods. 16 out of the last 17 years have been the hottest on record. So there are a lot of things out there that say, hey, it's hot. But heat is only one element. So heat is a measure of energy, right? So when it comes to the weather, heat is the thing that causes storms to be more energetic, frequent, chaotic, unpredictable. So it's not only that the temperatures go up and things get hotter and ice caps melt and water levels rise, but also that things become more volatile, right? And that's a simple function of thermodynamics, right? You put more heat and more energy into something, it becomes more active. So then, of course, there's the sea level rise. Most of the world's population lives within a couple of miles of the sea. So sea level rise of a few feet means millions of people are forced to move. In addition, a lot of our food production, particularly in Asia, relies on the river deltas and such. So that's obviously a concern. And then also, so even if we control temperature, and this is a good debate when it comes to climate engineering. So even if we put up aerosols or particles that reflect sunlight, one of the problems that we still have with an increased level of carbon dioxide is acidification of the oceans, right? So additional carbon dioxide in the ocean makes it more acidic and makes it so that it is more difficult for life to form there, increases the incidences of things like algae blooms, which then basically suck all the oxygen out and kill entire areas of the ocean. So that's a concern because a lot of the food circle originates with the ocean, right? Phytoplankton, little tiny things, and that kind of works its way up the food chain. And so this really all comes down to carbon release and storage. There are other gases out there. Methane, of course, is more powerful than carbon dioxide, but it's emitted in lower quantities. And so how do we control and or store carbon? We'll go through a couple of ideas and then have some discussion about it later. And again, I think it's important, I personally think it's important to realize that it really doesn't matter if it's caused by humans or not. It really doesn't. It doesn't matter if it's from fossil fuels or whatever. It's good to know the source, right, to help figure out what the levels are so we can measure and counteract them. But let's just say it was a cyclical thing and the Earth was getting hotter and the permafrost started melting and more carbon dioxide started going into the air. Does it really matter who caused it, right? I don't see a point, right? If we have the Earth on a runaway heating cycle, then we should figure out how to exist within that. It just, to me, seems like the right answer. So there's kind of two different mindsets of how we're going to get out of this bind that we're in. So on one hand, you have conservation, right? So we can limit the amount of carbon dioxide we put out. So the carbon dioxide quantities that are in the air now are still at record highs historically over millennia based on sampling, Earth, different layers of the Earth. And so even if we completely stop now, we'd still be at a higher level than we've ever been. So while conservation is important in the long run, when it comes to efficiency and those sorts of things, we also have to look to innovation. So how do we overcome the situation we're already in? So I think both are important. Conservation is a bit harder, I think, mentally for folks, because they have to stop doing something that they're already doing and comfortable with, right? So this is where a lot of the politics come into it. We like burning fossil fuels because it's easier. Honestly, you go to a gas station, you fill it up, it's portable, it's energy dense. It's the reason that we transitioned from the pre-industrial age through the industrial age. That's how it happened. But then innovation is something that people are kind of hoping and wishing for, but I don't know that we're really investing the time, money, energy into finding the kinds of innovation that are actually going to get us over this hump. So whether that's increasing our ability to do carbon storage, whether it's through machines that do that or figuring out planting schemes, whatever it is, we're going to grow bamboo because it grows fast so we can store carbon and turn it into a different product and keep it trapped, right? So what are we doing right now? How are we investing in those things? But really, both of those are ultimately about resource efficiency on the macro level, right? We have this closed system, relatively, called the Earth, right? Yes, we get energy from the sun, of course, but that's, if you want to consider the solar system, then that's a closed system, right? So how do we marshal and guard the resources we have so that they continue to be there for us when we need them, right? So I don't know if you guys have heard of, what's the day? It's like the Earth Resource Day. It happens sometime in August now. It's basically the estimated day that they think that we've used all of the resources that the Earth can replenish in a given year. And since they started calculating it, it's been moving back from December 31st, right, which would be a year, farther and farther back every year to where it's now in August. So in half a year, we use what the Earth can replenish in a full year. So how do we change that efficiency ratio, right? How do we make that so that it's actually a year or better than a year, so that we're becoming more and more resource rich as opposed to becoming resource poor? I think one way that we can get after this is if we stop thinking in terms of economics, right? So economics are a political reality, but they're kind of an academic exercise, right? The economy that we have today is a construct that evolved over time that allowed us to exchange value with each other. In determining ownership, who owns what, how do you know who owns a thing? We've set up these legal systems roughly based on if we're putting some energy or value into it, right? If you work your land and you collect those crops, those are your crops then that you can sell to others, right? That's roughly how we build inherent value. There's a lot of philosophy we can go into, but we're not going to do that today. But when you look at the world and the resources on it, and the people who are here, and the technology we have, there's no reason that everyone couldn't have the minimum to get by, right? So I'm not talking about socialism or communism, a political system where you force distribute everything, but when you just look at the numbers of resources and the numbers of people and the things that people want at a basic level, there is enough for everyone. But our structure is not really set up to deliver that. So to me, innovation, when it comes to protecting our resources, our planetary resources, some of that will come in the form of technology, carbon scrubbers and different things like that. But I think a lot of it's going to have to be in the realm of critical thought when it comes to restructuring how we interact as humans. So there's a great book that's a good philosophical exercise in what a developed country economy might look like. What happens when people can build just about anything they need kind of on the fly? And so the book is called Walk Away. I highly recommend reading it. It's just a very interesting idea. The writing is a little bit rough because I think he self-published the book, and it kind of goes on a bit at the end. But the ideas in there are very, very interesting, particularly in the first third to half of the book when they're talking about the idea of post-scarcity. So what if we have everything we need, but we're just not using it well, right? We could gain a lot of that efficiency back. We could move that ratio back to a year. We could decrease the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that we produce simply by realizing that we don't need to hoard things when there are things available to us. If we structure our communities and the ways that we interact in sustainable ways on both the micro and macro level. So Detroit, I think, is a terrific example. So Detroit was a highly densely populated city back in the 20th century, right? I think it was the third most populous city in the country back then. And now there are huge swaths of land that are just vacant. The city tore down tens of thousands of houses because people were lighting them on fire around Halloween. And so people have moved back into that area with houses that are left, refurbished those houses, and then created like community greenhouses. Nobody organized this. They just, like the city didn't, or the county, or whatever it was, they just decided, hey, this helps us be sustainable. So what if we started thinking along those lines, in terms of little micro communities that can provide for themselves, at least the bare minimum? You know, it's great to have the luxuries that we have today, that we can live stream things, and we have the technologies, you know, that make us more comfortable, or whatever it happens to be. But if we start rethinking what human interaction and community should look like, I think we have a path forward to fix our imbalance. So now the political issues. So we have this idea of individualism or individual action versus collective action, right? So a lot of people think, well, what can I do about this? I'm one person. If I turn, you know, my AC down, is it really that big a deal? Or if I have an inefficient car, is it that big a deal? You know, numerically, no. But because we have that thought, right, we have that bystander effect where, well, I don't see anybody else doing anything, so why should I, right? That's going to prevent everybody from doing something. So I think that's one important thing, is to realize that individuals do make a difference, particularly if they aggregate. But I think we also realize that it would be naive to think that if just all of the individuals did something, it would be all better, right? Because the structures aren't incentivized correctly. So we also have to have collective action, and that means engaging in the political realm. So how do we do that? Right? I don't have the answer for that. How do you fix political incentives so that you know, we're not promoting, you know, on one hand, you can't just stop using fossil fuels all of a sudden, right? That's not realistic, at least not right now, and particularly not for people who don't have the money to do it. But how do we transition to things that are renewable? I think there's a lot of economic incentive nowadays. I think people realize that there's a demand for renewable energy, and that there are elements of it that make it more sustainable and more resilient than fossil fuels to an extent. So that's one way, of course, is just through the power of the wallet, right? Power of the checkbook, that we can go out and say, I'm interested in these things, please make them. But then I think there's also political advocacy, right? Particularly on our part, to talk to our representatives and say, look, I understand that oil companies are basically paying you to go in this direction. We'd like you to go in this other direction. So if you'd like our votes, please go in this other direction, right? So there are ways to do that. And that definitely takes that engagement too, right? So I think a lot of times, especially in the political world, we are made to feel, and I think somewhat intentionally, as though we don't have power, that we aren't able to influence. And I don't think that's true. I really do think politicians do listen to an extent to the voter, particularly at the more local levels, because you know, every vote does count at the end of the day. And so this kind of begs the question, can we do both? Can you do individual action and collective action? I think we can. So much like how we've talked about engaging in the church and engaging in the ideas of humanism, it starts with setting an example, right? So I think if we set the example, if we engage politically, if we educate ourselves on the issues, I think it encourages others to do the same. And if we find those other like-minded people, like the church, we can start banding together to say, hey, this is really important to us, because to me, it's about our kids, right? Many of us are not going to be around when the worst of these effects hit. But I care very much about my kids' future. And I'm really surprised, honestly, in the political world that I've not seen more discussion. You know, I'm pretty sure it's been specifically avoided, that we are ruining our children's future. And in everything else in our personal lives, we would sacrifice so much to give our kids a better future, right? I know my dad, you know, before I was born, with his other kids, would barely eat just so he could feed his kids, right? And I know that I will do extra work and extra activities and stay up late so I can care for my kids. So why can we not have a little bit of political, economic discomfort to provide a world for our children in the future? To me, it seems fairly reasonable. And I think if we start to have that conversation, it's not about today, It's about the future, and our children's future in particular. So of course, this gets into the realm of capitalism versus central planning, right? So capitalism is kind of a loaded term, particularly nowadays, but I think it has been for a while. I think it's become this idea of the free market being the perfect or ideal state, right? That the market, which is totally free, is then most perfect. And I think we've seen periods throughout history where we know that this is very much not true. When there are no rules regulating markets, people get severely taken advantage of, particularly workers. Here you talk about the robber barons of the 1900s, the people who actually incited riots and committed espionage and even assassination against each other. And you just look at the meltdown in 2008 of the banks when they weren't regulated. And who did that hurt? Very few of the bank executives or the boards of those banks or the shareholders in the short term maybe, but did hurt millions of Americans and people around the world because there wasn't regulation. So I think this idea of unbridled capitalism is being perfect is false. Now, there are elements of capitalism that are far more efficient because you have, the market pressures, et cetera, regulating more on the smaller level, individual exchange. But there are elements of central planning that, to me, are necessary, right? So it's a well-known economic principle called the tragedy of the commons, that when no one owns a thing, everyone will use the resource until it's depleted. That's the earth. That's literally a description of what we're doing to the earth right now. Nobody has taken ideological ownership of the earth, right? And who would? How would we do that? I don't know. I don't have that answer. But I think it's an important question that we have to ask, because if no one owns the earth, who's caring for it? Right now, I'd say we certainly aren't. So how do we build in that idea of central planning into our resources? Right? Is it the 200-mile economic exclusion zone outside of every country? No, because that's still leaves the giant plastic wastelands in the middle of the ocean. Right? What about the air? What about space? What about space junk? What about our ability to communicate and do research? What about nutrient runoff into the oceans? All of these things require somebody to put some thought into it. And if left to the market, won't happen, and traditionally happen, right? I don't know if any of you remember that dilution is the pollution solution. Y'all remember that phrase? The idea earlier in the 1900s was that we could just throw all our trash in the ocean or throw chemicals in the ocean, and it would be diluted to such a small extent that it's no longer harmful, right? That's how we at one point took care of things when the markets were less regulated in terms of the environment. So I think there has to be a balance, right? So I'm not saying capitalism is bad. I'm not saying we should transition to socialism and communism, because again, those are political constructs, not economic ones necessarily, though there are elements of economics in there. But that there is an element of individual action, a little bit of self-regulation, and then an element of central planning and working toward a future that we want to see. I think those are both important parts of how we move forward. And then, of course, so one of the big discussions, at least at the UN right now with environment, is the balance between what developed countries are willing to pay versus what developing countries are willing to pay, right? Because the developed countries want to say, oh, developing countries, you're going to go through this period where you have to, or where traditionally you would have burned all of these fossil fuels and then created a lot of greenhouse gases. We don't want you to do that. We want you to spend a lot more money on technologies that we're producing to then produce clean energy. And so developing countries are like, yeah, that sounds like BS, because you all are the ones that contributed the majority of the greenhouse gases, so therefore you should be investing in this technology to help usher us through this era. And that's the thing that they cannot agree on right now in these summits of how much money, where it's going to come from, how it's going to be distributed, et cetera. So, and I get it in the short term, right? We've talked about finite and infinite games a couple of times. In the finite game, when you're looking at the next election, right, you lose if you give another country a bunch of your money, right? That looks like a losing proposition. But in the infinite game, where the goal is to keep playing, it seems like having a world is a little bit more important than losing an election. To me, like the two are a little bit out of balance. But of course, our incentives aren't set up like that. So how do we put more pressure on the side of the scale that says, I'd like to have a world, please? And that's something I think that's important for us to think about. Because if it takes us investing in developing countries to save the planet, we should do it. If it takes us cutting our GDP in half to save the planet, we do it, right? Because if we have phenomenal GDP growth for the next 10 years, and then we all catch on fire, like that's not a win, no matter how great your GDP growth is. To me, it's pretty straightforward. So to me, I wouldn't even say to me, I'd just say based on science, our advantage as humans, the reason we have become so dominant, in fact, so dominant now that we have the majority power basically in shaping the world, is our ability to modify our environment to suit our needs, right? And if we can do that, and we have, I was reading, as I was preparing for this, that we've converted something like 2/5 of the world's land area into farmland, basically, either for pastures or for crops. 2/5 of all of the world's land mass. And you got to think that includes things like mountains and things that we wouldn't normally use for farming anyway. So of all the land in the world, nearly half of it has been shaped by us directly. And then much of it, I'm sure, indirectly as well. So if we have that ability, why do we not have the ability to shape it sustainably? And I would argue that we actually do have the ability. We need to refine some of those techniques, but what we really need to have is the will. The will to shape our environment, to provide for our future. As I mentioned earlier, to me, the most important part of advancing that ability is advancing our understanding, right? If we're going to throw particles up in the air to reflect the sun, we should probably try and figure out what that's going to do to us, right? Do we go into the matrix scenario where we've now darkened the sky? Who knows? But I'd kind of like to invest some research into that area. How do we protect permafrost, right? How do we protect the ice caps? How do we reduce sea levels? How do we do these things? Do we figure out a giant air conditioning unit for the North and South poles and then vent that heat into space? Sounds crazy. Maybe we could do it. Who knows? What does it look like? But those are the things we need to do now, is we need to start understanding what these effects are going to be, how we might be able to get after it, what the crazy ideas might do to us. And so I'd say our call to action this week for us as a small group is to get smart about it. Go out there and read. I'll post a link later. It's from NASA. And they kind of list just the main bullet points, like here's climate change, here are the concerns, here's kind of the way forward. And by the way, a lot of the estimates they have about the effects of climate change are extremely conservative. They're assuming the really, really best case scenarios. So even if we meet the Paris Accord goals by 2030, which right now is not even close to happening, then only in the best case are we okay, which is likely not going to happen. or likely in the medium case, which is actually not that good at all. So I think it's imperative that we start getting smart about this. And we start just having conversations. Again, if we set the example and speak with other people and say, hey, what do you think about this? I kind of think it's really important because I want a world for my kids. And they're like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. And get them on board and counteract some of the misinformation out there. I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. So with that, we'll do our gratitudes at the end, but I want to open up just for discussion. Because I think this is really important, and it's something that I'm not an expert in, and I don't grasp fully. I mean, obviously it's a global concept. So I just wanted to see what questions you all have, or what topics you want to bring up that you think are important for people to understand. Derek.
I have studied this for about 3 decades, pretty closely, and it's been an area of interest. There are things we can do individually. But what you're pointing out is the nexus that we're at right at the moment. And the nexus isn't just climate change. The nexus is the automation of jobs. We're soon not going to have jobs for humans. Pretty soon technology is going to be able to replicate itself. And I'm not talking about science fiction. We already have robots making other robots to build cars or whatever.
Right.
And artificial intelligence is coming our way. What you're talking about in basic change of government and viewpoint from people is going to have to come, and it's being proposed, to a point where either we go into the rich and then everybody else who are absolutely starving, uneducated, no way out. You're going to have that scenario. Or you're going to have the scenario where we have what's called a universal wage, a basic wage. In other words, everybody gets the same basic wage. It's not communism. You pick your products.
Right.
But since there's no employment for you, we need to keep the economy going. We need to have everybody be able to buy food, etc. And you mentioned something about what we could do. In 2003, 2002, actually, I saw a visionary and I decided to support it. And I was just a master sergeant. I wasn't rich, didn't have a rich family, didn't have a lot of money. But I could do businesses on the side, unlike officers, okay? So I could go ahead and start companies, et cetera, which I did. I started the first private internet service in Bitburg, Germany, when I was in Germany for 7 years. Little things like that to get the resources to do something. So when Elon Musk decided to start SpaceX and then to fund Tesla, everybody said, no way, no electric cars, it's never going to happen, okay? Well, I was waiting to invest. I only had like $25,000, but I was waiting to use that. Well, then he came out with the car in 2008 during the crisis and he survived. Everybody said, oh, I can't do it, and they still didn't believe it. Then when he came past that 2 years and we were allowed to buy in, I bought 1,000 shares with $25,000. No big deal. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying it doesn't take much if you see the vision of somebody that's doing something. Well, we're moving, so I couldn't afford to wait through another one of the volatile times because it's going to go back up. So I cashed in my $25,000 2 weeks ago for $348,000, which is not bad for 8 years. Okay. Yep. So I went ahead and put that into cash available so we could buy our house in Colorado wherever we decide to land. I was not investing in Tesla for the return as much as I was investing in Tesla to help it happen. And as a result of that, and a lot of other people, right now the entire industry is flipping over to electric cars.
Yep. Yep. I think every car company now is producing an electric car, and I think Volvo said they're not going to produce any fossil fuel cars after the last hybrid that they're producing.
Well, what I would suggest, if anybody wants to get hip to what we're discussing here from every aspect, start subscribing to Clean Technica, okay? Or send me an email and I'll send you the links to it. And they have a compilation of all this news from the industry. But I'm taking up too much time and I really want to get to the main issue. That one man changed the entire world, okay? He got us off of it, and even I was just 50-50 praying it was going to happen. Well, they got everybody off dead center. Now, it is actually no more expensive to build renewable energy power generating plants. It costs the same to build a plant. The difference is you don't have coal or anything else, nuclear or whatever, coming in constantly. It just takes care of it, and all we needed was the batteries destroyed.
Right.
Tess already took care of that for Australia. But here's the main one everybody missed. In 1998, at the Ames Laboratories in California, they developed the first magnetic refrigerator. This is so basic, and it ties into everything you're talking about. And what it does is it, instead of having a compressor, it uses rare earth metals and literally uses no more power than an electric fan. A fan this big or so that would cool this room, just a fan, okay? There's no compressor. They perfected it, and somebody bought the patent for it. And they disappeared. Never heard anything else about it. Now, this sounds like one of those conspiracy things. If anybody wants to come over to my house, I'll show you the entire track record of that particular line of research. Now, why is it important? Two things. One, if you've never been in traffic in California or heavy city where you're sitting for 20 minutes in one spot and you've got 8 lanes of traffic and you're breathing all that exhaust, that's also heat going out there. It's also the carbon dioxide as well as other bad things. But what about your air conditioner? You got 1 million air conditioners in one city in the south, all of them venting heat into the atmosphere.
Yep.
And that's all over every part of the world. And as it gets hotter, we're going to generate more of it. And we're all going to go, yeah, but we're going to die in case. Here's my bottom line, and I'll shut up, let's open it up to everybody else. Once we get magnetic refrigeration on the tops of buildings and in houses, that's going to take all of the stress off the electrical system. It really will, okay? Especially as we get hotter. And people are just now starting to get back into that because the patent's run out since 1998. But it's like everybody's trying to keep it a secret in the energy division, and it's going to take some work. And everybody goes, oh, you can't do that, just like they did the electric car. Technology will solve some of that, but we've got to get it going. So right now, the money interests in the United States, we are being the stupidest country in the world, and the people who want to keep us subjugated,
Consumerism,
are going to keep us stupid. You know, we're the only country in the world that's a civilized country, not a third world or second world country, that does not have socialized medicine and universal free college education.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two things we need to get going first so other people can comprehend what they're doing. And then the last thing is we need to get people to vote.
Yeah, so I have this concept of basically education, of course, informs voting, which informs politics, which informs how the education is structured, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think there's any incentive personally for people in power to improve education systems.
I agree.
So basically, that there's no incentive for politicians to improve education systems because right now they're getting voted for the way they want. So I think you're right. I think that's exactly what you're talking about, is that we need to educate people so that they want to understand topics like this, that they understand that they're being taken advantage of. But you brought up a good point. So let's say the refrigeration thing, magnetic refrigerators, right, reduces the draw on the energy grid, right? Why do we have an energy grid?
Why? We don't need it.
Right, realistically, you don't need it.
Today we have the technology and you can buy it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So you can get panels for your house that covers most of your energy needs, especially if we decrease or basically increase the efficiency, decrease the overall usage. You could actually just have all your own power. Now it would take an upfront investment, and right now that's somewhat expensive, right? To get all solar panels on your roof and maybe wind generator, whatever else. But like all of this extra energy that you have lost in the grid, like that stuff can be pretty easily done. Maybe not today at the very basic consumer level. It's not something that everybody could buy.
Can I just correct that real quick? We had a tariff on solar cells imported from China since long before Trump came in office.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's the reason we actually pay 30% more, and they're not letting us buy them, and the rest of the world is buying those and putting them in place. But PV is not the only one. You also have concentrated solar, 3 different methodologies for that. And now we can store the power. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yep.
You're right on one of my.
No, but see, this is fantastic because all of this stuff is out there, and so I'm familiar with some of those methods. But people maybe don't know, right? Maybe they don't know that it's not science fiction, it's actually real, right? There are places that are building, these power plants, and they're becoming more viable, right? And so the companies, right, that we've relied on to give us everything it is we need are starting to invest in it. But what about at the personal level, right? What does our construct need to be, right? Do we need to have utilities?
When people see it, they'll buy it. And
Right.
right now, you can buy a Tesla Powerwall, which is a giant battery, and it's about this wide.
It's about
that thick,
$4,800, yeah.
and it looks really nice. It goes in your house, or it can sit outside
Yep.
on the wall, either way. No noise. I have a 25 kW generator that runs on natural gas. I don't like blackouts.
Yeah.
I like to watch my TV. All right, that's it. It's burning natural gas and generating the carbon. If I had one of those they're like $4,400 for a 3 kW, I'd need about 3 of them, so that's $12,000. My whole house generator costs $12,000 after you install it and pay for the electricians
Right.
and everything else. So it's costing less actually because I don't have to put natural gas in it.
Right.
That's just for the batteries. Then you gotta go with the solar, and we can't get around the solar part of it.
Right.
Until we get the tariffs off of the Chinese cheaper solar panels. But right now, you can get solar and the Tesla stuff right now for about 25, 30,000. Now, if you're not like me where I can't stand the climate here and I'm moving, and you're gonna stay here forever, and you've got more than 100,000 in the bank, I'd put 25, 30,000 into a distributed energy solution for yourself, because you may not have it off the grid if we get an attack cyber-wise. I'm sorry, I know I'm a big mouth.
No, but that's fine.
It's what I've been interested in for years.
So I think this is an important conversation for people to have, because they may not know that. They may not be reading, articles on clean energy and different ways to generate power. But again, so these are technologies that are great, and it's great that people are producing them. But it's more about imagining life in a different way, I think. Right? So, yeah, go ahead.
I have a point. We were in Germany for 7 years. 7 years I got used to recycling. Down to the household.
Yeah.
I'm getting back to basics.
Yeah.
I had bins in my
Yeah.
kitchen that were for paper and for plastic and aluminum and garbage.
I remember.
I mean, and I got used to that. We came back to the States and I'm like, okay, where's the recycling?
Yeah, places don't even have recycling.
I'm like, what? I put everything in one garbage can. I couldn't do it. It was like, this is wrong on
Yep.
so many levels.
But
It goes from
yeah.
country to country too.
Well, but that's a great point, because people think, recycling, it doesn't make that much of a difference. That doesn't matter to me if you make that much of a difference. To me, again, it's about resource efficiency.
Right.
So I've looked into some things to figure out how you actually can recycle at a much smaller scale. And there are some kind of do-it-yourself industrial-ish projects that you can do to recycle metal and recycle plastic and recycle glass that I'm interested in doing, once we have like a physical church. Because like aluminum and steel and copper, like those things are actually pretty expensive when you think about it at the bigger level. So if you had a small scale recycling, and then you start to use things like 3D printers and rapid manufacturing, you can create kind of your own entire microeconomy for a community. You've got people maybe who are inventive that don't have a lot of resources to invest in all of that stuff. But if you had that set up as a small community, you provide outlets for people who maybe don't have the pathways to college, like you were talking about, since we don't have universal education, so that they can get in there and learn, and we can have apprenticeships, right? So it's an entirely different structure than what currently exists, where we rely on the market for everything. What if we relied on ourselves for more? What if we structured how we were resilient, right? So you talked about the grid going down in the case of a cyber attack. Well, if you have a small, basically closed cell in a community, that doesn't matter to you because you produce your own power. You have a lot of your raw materials because you have the amount of consumerism we have today has provided us with enough stuff around us. We go to the landfill and be like, hey, can we dig up some of your landfill? And be like, yes, please, because we have to pay for this, right? And we recycle their stuff that they've just dumped in the landfills. And we can produce things and fix things, right? So it's an entirely different concept. So how do we start thinking about that? How do we envision that future? And I think we can. I think through a little bit of education. And that's why I think the call to action today is just get smart. So
And stop thinking of it as pie in the sky.
Yeah.
2005, Michael Stritzky did with Elon Musk, and he built the Hopewell project in New Jersey. And he lived in it, and he had a house that used no grid power. He had electric, and he also had hydrogen fuel cells, and he produced his own hydrogen with solar power on the garage. He had all these regular batteries, which now you can solve with the power walls. Long story short, he converted all his cars to hydrogen, used the propane tanks you see behind trailers to store the hydrogen that he produced. And in this garage-looking place, it had all the solar panels, all the batteries, and the electrolysis unit that produced the hydrogen very inefficiently, but efficiently enough for one family.
Yep.
And this whole thing just never got adopted by everybody. That was my hope in the turn of the century was hydrogen. But
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is there's a high upfront cost, right? And people always talk about scale. Well, how do you scale it? Well, you need some company to say, yes, I can make enough money from this to turn it into a business, right? And that's kind of my point is that we've come to rely on the economy for everything. And the economy relies on us to buy stuff, just buy more stuff, right? We know that they've built in planned obsolescence, that they plan for things to break, right? They don't design them, like they literally don't design them like they used to. Like I have seen vacuums from the 1950s that still function because they're not energy efficient and they're not particularly even good now at cleaning relative to what we have today, but they're made out of metal gears and whatnot, so they actually will last. Same thing with I remember the KitchenAid mixers from that period too. They still work because the motor housings are metal and the gears are metal, whereas a lot of the things today are different kinds of plastic or alloys and they break. So there are trade-offs and there are ways that we can demand things, but we have allowed ourselves to be, I don't know if deceived is, I guess kind of deceived is the phrase that I'm thinking of, but we've allowed ourselves to be deceived or tricked into this thinking that this is the way it has to be. That I can only buy what's available, right? I can only buy what's on Amazon or only buy what's in the store. But we know that's not true. If enough people come up and say, I'm interested in this thing, some creative person out there, maybe it's one of us, will say, well, I can make that. I know how to make that. I got a 3D printer and this different stuff. I can get these metals in from this scrap area and I can make that. But it's thinking that that's possible, right? That's the idea of post-scarcity, is that we have what we need. We just have to rethink how we're doing it.
how many poor people have geniuses among them who will never get to college?
Yep.
That would benefit us, me personally, and you personally.
I think you're leaving out a couple of things.
Okay.
Who runs our country? Who really runs our country is wealthy people.
Mm-hmm.
Wealthy people are less inclined to worry about climate change. Because if a wealthy person lives on the coast and the ocean rises, they've got the resources to pick up and move someplace better. If Louisiana gets too hot for humans to survive, that's okay. The politicians and their wealthy donors have enough money to move to Colorado where it's not so hot and will probably become a little bit more temperate and actually a better place to be in the wintertime. So they don't really care what happens to the rest of us. The other thing you're leaving out is religion. You have a certain number of Christian Dominion believers in the White House, in Congress and the Senate, who don't believe the world is going to continue to exist for very much longer.
And they're looking
And so they don't
forward to
care.
it.
And they're looking
Yes,
forward to
exactly.
it. And I look at it like this. Let's say that you and your wife and kids and maybe some friends and their kids, you go on vacation and you check into a hotel. And let's say the hotel manager comes out to you while you're checking in and says, let your kids do anything they want. They're tearing this place down next week. So it's okay if they color on the walls, it's okay if they tear up the carpet and knock holes in the walls. Let them have a great time because it's all being torn down in a week. Would you make sure that your kids pick their wet towel up off the carpet?
Good point.
You wouldn't, because if it's not gonna be there, it doesn't matter that you don't take care of it. And if they truly believe it's not gonna be here, then why would you do austerity? Why would you deny yourself pleasure today when it's not gonna make a difference in a week?
Yep.
And that's how they're treating our earth.
Good point.
So,
Good point.
but, and this is great conversation because that's one of the, that's actually, environmentalism was in my mind when we were talking about kind of the mission of the church, right? Advance and protect humanity. That's an idea that people need to hold in their mind. And I don't know what other organization has that as their goal, right? There might be some, maybe there are some environmental organizations, maybe there are some other places out there. I've not heard of too many churches with that goal in mind, right? It's normally eternal salvation.
The other thing you have is you're not gonna get a politician to agree on a 50-year plan to save the world.
So here's the thing is,
3 years are gonna be elected, that's all they're focused on.
nope, I got you. So I don't think that's entirely true. So again, it comes back to changing the ways that we think about things. If we think what you said, that we will never get a politician, right? Basically, it's one of those not with that attitude kind of things.
Exactly.
So how do we incentivize longer term politicians? How do we do that? Right? So I think it is actually doable.
Yeah, I guess if everybody that's voting wants
again,
to make that, wants a 50-year
It's
plan.
educating voters,
Yeah.
right? It's having that virtuous cycle, educating voters, then having them go out and vote and hold politicians accountable, and saying this is something that we want. Think about back in the 70s when they had the first first Environmental Act under Nixon, who was a Republican president, right?
Creation of the EPA.
Creation of the EPA, putting standards on air, because the cities in the United States were just choked with smog.
Hey, good to see.
Couldn't see, couldn't breathe, people got sick,
Drinking the water.
right? Rivers caught on fire,
Trees died.
right? Acid rain, like it was not good,
Yeah.
right? But it was more, so the thing with that, it was a little bit more visible. As we continue to have hundreds of thousands of square miles of wildfires every year because it's hotter and drier, people are going to start saying like, this is enough.
But why does it have to get to that point?
So things only change rapidly for generally one reason, and that's because of a crisis.
Right.
So for any large bureaucracy, it's just a function of bureaucracy, to be honest, is it often requires crisis. Now, ideally with that crisis, we capitalize on that and then do that where we're incentivizing education and getting people into that virtuous cycle and continuing that on. The hardest thing is that as we get more affluent, we get more lazy, right? So it's funny when people talk to me about like immigration and when immigrants come here and how much they don't like it. To me, I look at them and oftentimes look at their kids and I say, I think I would take immigrant workers over y'all because I bet they're going to work their butts off because they know they have the perspective to know how to be grateful for what this country offers.
They also are highly competitive with each other for the job.
But it's about hard working and even beyond hard working, it's about perspective. It's realizing that nothing in your life is guaranteed except for what you work toward. And even that's questionable, but that's the only thing you control. You control what you do. So, but I agree with you. That is going to be difficult to overcome, but we need to start thinking of how do we do that? How do we solve that part of the process where we incentivize folks to do that?
In our local elections, it's very difficult. Our last election for congressman, we had 4 white, male, Republican, conservative Christians running. 4. I mean, you almost couldn't tell them apart.
Did anyone else even run?
No, that's the thing. Nobody
So,
else
but to me,
ran.
that's the key point, right? So when we see this election cycle, that more people who are not traditional candidates are running, right? If that's the thing where you're thinking differently, right? If you want to see an alternative to what we have to create the alternative. We can't rely on the market or other people anymore.
Well, the one that won was Ryan Gaddy, and he is the attorney for Christ Fit Gym in the lawsuit about their football field. And he was actually the least worst of the 4. And I actually voted for Ryan Gaddy because I thought he was the least worst of all the 4.
So, but that's the thing.
That's still pretty bad.
No, I got you.
When your
choices are so.
when your choices are, you know.
But the reason that your choices are limited is because no one thought they could win, right? Their framework for the election is that, well, I'm not going to win anyway, so I'm not going to try. And how many people were looking for that other candidate?
Yeah.
Right.
Not less than 50%. I promise you, in this area, nobody but a white conservative
I got you.
Republican Christian could get.
I got you.
elected.
So,
But you'll never hear them because the people that get elected are getting their money
Right.
directly from the corporations that are interested in the results, and this is an oil state.
okay. So, but to keep us a little bit more on track, part of the problem with that mindset is that no one else even knows what the demand is, right? So if you had a candidate out there, you would at least know how many other people are interested, right? So oftentimes, and I did some research on third parties. People like to put down third parties like, oh, well, they're never going to win anyway, and this, and this. But if you look at what purpose they have served in elections, is they will often bring issues to light. So let's say you have a candidate that's not the mainstream, but that runs and gets a significant amount of votes. Say they win no electoral college votes in the presidency, or they don't win anything in the local elections, but they have a good chunk of voters who are interested in a particular issue, say environmentalism. The next time the traditional folks run, they're going to try and get a chunk of those voters. So oftentimes they will shift on particular topics and represent for those topics because of that third party. So again, this is not about the third party or Republican or Democratic. This is about thinking differently and how do we influence systems to be incentivized for what it is we're trying to accomplish. You have something?
No. Well, I was just wondering myself, what of the energy we have, what percentage comes from renewable energy? Clean.
Nationally?
Wind, solar, what do y'all?
Other countries are worldwide.
This right here.
United States.
We've got probably about 2% to 3% that's gaining on nuclear energy, but it's mostly PV solar, which is not the most efficient, but it's the easiest to do.
So it's not 10 or 20%?
But you have India and China have already surpassed us.
It's actually 18.
I'm sorry?
It's actually 18.
18%?
Just in the United States?
Yeah.
I'll say it Norway.
This is from a Forbes, or I'm sorry, a Fortune article.
Probably.
The other countries are incentivizing it this way. You will not be allowed to buy a gas car by 2025 with some countries, or 2030. You can, if you have one, you can run it if you can find the fuel, they're gonna do that. But London already does not allow any we call ice age vehicles in their deal. That means internal combustion engine. So they don't allow anything in London. Austria, we skied in the 90s up in Vermont, Switzerland. No internal combustion engines allowed from the 70s on. This is what got me started on the energy. They had little electric pickup trucks and little electric taxis. These guys were nuts. It was like drivers from Hong Kong.
Yeah.
All over the city, like 90 miles.
So similar to like what we would consider golf carts.
No, these were jacked up fast vehicles that could handle like 12 passengers.
Probably more like
air
that.
gates.
Yeah.
These were, and that was
So,
back then, so.
yeah.
we had
So
all-
it's 18%, so there's an article that came out in February from Fortune, it says 18% in the US, and about 60% of that is wind and solar.
I was just curious,
Yeah.
is it, I mean, how much has it grown over the years? I mean, is it getting better or is it?
Yeah, it's going up
plateauing?
and it's going up, but it's going up faster because it's getting much, much, much cheaper. So as Derek was saying, it's much cheaper now.
Right through Texas.
You do it for the same price or less than a gold,
Yeah.
gold.
So despite this administration, it is going up.
Well, I would say actually, it's at this point, it's now economy, right? So it's now economically efficient to invest in renewable energy.
I've spoke to some people in the wind industry that set them up and everything, and they were talking about how the fact that they have the farmers lease out this land for windmills now, and they don't need to do anything anymore. They just sit back and collect the rent on these windmills and don't even need to farm for anything other than a hobby at this point, because it's.
I didn't hear a word of that. Could you
So
say
you're saying that farmers don't have to, the farmers lease out their land for the wind farms?
Yeah.
And it helps to basically offset the money they're not making farming. And so depending on the amount of land and the amount of wind towers they put up, they may not even have to farm anymore. So it's becoming economically viable. And especially as we continue to invest in high efficiency transmission lines, which is that's one of the key detractors to wind energy is how do you transport the energy, right? But as they continue to build that out, it'll become more efficient.
Well, that's room temperature semiconductors that
Right.
just now.
Yeah, I saw it recently.
They may or may not have actually achieved it. There was some debate about whether or not it actually happened.
Yeah, it hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but I did see that study that they may have found room temperature superconductors which allow for low resistance transmission of energy, right? So that's the key thing for wind energy is getting it from the plains to cities.
The
I heard
biggest
about-
problem was intermittent power, the peaker plants and the
Right.
cost to come in.
But I heard about a giant battery, and I don't know if they're building this or if it's just proposed.
Tesla, Australia, largest battery in the world, installed last December.
No, okay, but that's a traditional chemical type
Yeah.
battery?
Yeah.
Okay, this absolutely amazing, simple technology. You dig a lake on a mountain.
Okay.
When the sun's shining, you pump the water up the mountain into the lake.
It's a
When
gravity
the
battery.
sun's not shining, you you open the
Sluice,
sluice and it comes down and you
spin a turbine.
spin a
Yep.
turbine. So
So it's a renewable hydroelectric dam.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but it acts as a battery. You're storing the energy in the water at the top of, high up on the mountain, not at the top of the mountain, but high up
Yep.
on the mountain. And it's
Yep, absolutely.
not very damaging to the ecosystem.
And depending on where it is, you might actually be replenishing the ecosystem where you had allowed, or built something or dammed something or rerouted a river, whatever it is, to create a habitat, as we destroy wetlands. And so think about that even at the small scale level, right? So chemical batteries are one thing, and there are a lot of battery advances that are kind of in the chute as long as nobody buys up the patents and hides them. In terms of different kinds of, what are they called? Anodes and cathodes for batteries. Right now, they're made out of material that basically calcifies over time. It's not calcium, but basically, as they transfer back and forth, they become less and less efficient, but they've found new ways to construct the batteries to make it safer, have higher discharge rates, better capacities. So we'll have some of those, some more chemical batteries, but there are still limits to the amount of those materials that there are and how easy they are to access. But when you have things like gravity batteries or inertial batteries, if you have something on a low resistance platform and it's spinning, and you basically engage a gear like you would an engine, it'll then spin your motor until it winds down. So basically, if you have really, really heavy discs or something. So there are a lot of ways to do that, even at the smaller scale level. If you think about it really basically, they used to do this with what they called water wheels, right? So they can crank things up or crank things down, or it would run something that's pounding, rock or wheat or whatever it is. We can do this stuff if we start to think about it. Right? So how do we do that at the house level? What could you create that would store some energy, right? There are different ways to do it. So, but we need to think about these things as we continue to advance and try and create that more resilient resource system. What else? Cool things that you all have heard of that you think are neat and relevant?
Carbon storage. Like, I just read something, I think 2 weeks ago, about 6% of the carbon generated comes from the cement industry in the world.
Yep, it's highly carbon intense.
It uses a lot of fossil fuels, it uses a lot of things, and there's a new method, I forget where they were doing it, I think it's in Europe somewhere, where they're working on trapping that carbon in the concrete itself, which in turn actually makes it stronger and adds to its structural integrity. So they were trying to figure out a way to incorporate that. And I believe they're also working on trapping carbon in rocks in Iceland right now, trapping it permanently within the bedrock of the earth as well.
Basically pumping it down. Yeah, I think they're doing that in China as well.
It's weird because Iceland is one of those countries that's 100% renewable energy. They have a surplus of it, they just can't get rid of it because they don't have the high efficiency transmission to get it to the mainland Europe in order to use the geothermal that they generate there and access.
Yep. Yeah, so there's a lot of different neat stuff out there. Which, to wrap up on a positive note, it's not hopeless. I mean, to me, it's never hopeless until you're dead. And then you're dead, so you don't hope for anything. But it's all about looking at what we can do, what we can control. And there's a lot that we can do. But we have to think differently about many of these problems to realize that none of them are hopeless. Some of them might be difficult or a pain or require investment or austerity, but they're all manageable. And so I just thought it was important to bring up as a topic for our consideration. So with that, we'll kill the video for now, and then we talk about our gratitude for the week, and then go do something fun. Thanks.